Here we are, back at the table. I need like more, do we need transition sentences every time we restart the Zoom? We don't. So property valuation and modernization, we have Jill Remick up on the screen. We have Rebecca Samaroff on a bench. We have Abby on a bench. The last few weeks, as I said, since we sort of were picking this apart to death and not really getting anywhere, we took a pause and asked tax to essentially come back to us with Abby and a solution. And the way I would sort of describe the solution is essentially, one, we combined the property value modernization bill and the homestead, non-homestead bill into one bill because they had started to blend together anyway. And we put the entire thing in progress. So in process, we enact the modernization changes, but the details of all the modernization changes are put in a series of studies that have checkbacks so that we can sort of approve each new phase as they roll it out. So that we can give them the time to do their good work and to be careful and deliberate and research, and we can be responsive to all of the towns that are asking us for motion and movement in the face of some real challenges regarding reappraisals and the CLA and things like that. So with that, Abby, whenever you're ready, or Jill, do you want to say anything before Abby takes us through the draft? Okay. Rebecca, do you want to say anything before Abby takes us through the draft?
No, I think that'd be a great order.
Okay, great. And then I'll say one more thing before Abby takes us through the draft. So one piece that we sort of left ourselves with before we took a pause on this was what's the problem we're trying to solve? And so the one piece that's missing from this draft is a really clear intent section. And that Abby is working on that. So there's some language that tax has offered on the intent section that is not part of this draft. And there's some language that Susanna Davis is sending me today as part of that intent section. And so that should be available like this afternoon, but just isn't ready yet.
Great.
And in a dream universe, we somehow finish this by tomorrow at 5:00.
Very dream.
Good.
Okay.
Great, thank you. For the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. Under my name, there is draft 3.7 today. It does have yesterday's date just because that's when I was last working on it, but that is the most up-to-date draft. As the chair just mentioned, this does not yet have a findings section. I'm working on that as well and waiting for a little more input. So that will become a new section 1. And that's based on data looking at the state of reappraisals throughout the state. That's the primary factual provision that will be there. So this is significantly different from the last draft that the committee has seen. I am also working on a section by section, but it's just my notes for now. So given that this will likely change between today and tomorrow, I'll have a section by section when you've voted it out. So the first section in this bill, just let me know if it's a little glitchy. So, okay, it's following on. The first section amends what was enacted last session, which was creating a state appraisal and litigation assistance program within PVR, effective starting this July. And last session, that was really focused on unique and very high value or very specific commercial properties. What this language does is it adds in to this program, which is within PVR, a reappraisal office. So it would create a program that's specific to the state carrying out reappraisals in towns. So rather than the towns being responsible, a reappraisal program is created within PVR. So a lot of the changes starting on page 2 are just splitting out this program into the complex and unique property appraisal and litigation section, and then also this new reappraisal authority that's given to PBR. So the first subsection A has a lot of those changes. It creates these new subdivisions A and B. One is for complex commercial, other unique properties. The second is for statistical and full reappraisals of each municipality's grand list properties. And it's very explicit that it's for purposes of both the municipal and the statewide education grand list, since under current statute, municipalities are valuing all properties for purposes of both grand lists.
On line 3 on the same page, your assist municipalities with the following. This does not say that the state will be the ones conducting the reappraisals. They're just assisting municipalities in some way, so they could do them or could not do them. Is that?
So the intent is for the state to be conducting these, or you'll see in the news, there's a new subdivision 2. It authorizes the commissioner to contract out. As that could be clearer. I could change that lead-in language. I think that's a good point.
Okay.
That has been raised. I believe the chair, you raised that question, whether in subdivision 2, because that's existing language saying the commissioner of taxes can contract. That was last session really focused on very complex or unique properties. So I think, yes, I think that's something I can absolutely change to be clearer that the state is conducting this, but with the authority to contract out, because the state doesn't currently have that ability or those, the resources to do it on their own.
This is giving the state the authority to basically reappraise all properties. Is it necessary to break up the 2 property types?
I would defer to the department on that, because I know that the last session, all of the work on unique and commercial properties was very targeted, and there are already some specific ways of valuing those properties that would be different from doing the entire grand list. But I don't know.
Let's hold that question for a minute. It's a great question.
No problem.
Just looking it out.
Or maybe let's not hold it. You want to
Rebecca Samroff, Deputy Commissioner of the Tax Department. I think this is like an interesting tension that you're both raising. And like one thing I just want to remind folks is that complex commercial appraisal assistance program is an elective program for municipalities. Like they would opt in if there was a challenging property that they needed support valuing. And then, what it would be, presumably they would use that value since they asked for it. But it is, different than the, this reappraisal cycle setting up both the transition and the future state there. So I think that's just like a tension of combining these sections this way, because that commercial one really should be an elective assistance program. Yeah. A complicated language wise.
Representative.
Yeah, I mean, I think I appreciate the idea of like working with existing statute to try to make as minimal modification as possible and work with something existing, but it seems like maybe like if we were to just start from scratch, might organize it or describe it a little differently, and maybe would encourage us to seek to find the deal.
So there is, as the Deputy Commissioner just mentioned, there is a distinction between the appraisal process, which is what the unique and commercial property valuation and litigation is getting at, whereas this is the reappraisal for, this consistent year over year reappraisal. So it's 2 different processes. It could be drafted differently. That is certainly something that has, throughout the different drafts has been attempted, but so much of it's already within this section that it, just because there's also so many outstanding questions that the report that's coming is going to address, that putting it into this was sort of the compromise.
And I guess I just want to make sure that Representative Andrews' question, like that there's clarity in the statute, in the language here regarding Representative Andrews' question.
Could you repeat the question? No, I'm not sure.
So I guess my question was, is it necessary to break these 2 parts out since it gives the state the authority to evaluate all properties? But I think what.
I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, I think the answer is yes.
Yes, and the mandatory versus elective,
Yeah.
plus here's the initial appraisal versus an ongoing reappraisal that's done on a cycle. They're very different processes. In terms of the drafting, I think because this is sort of following steps chronologically where this authority is being given on passage. So this section is being amended immediately as soon as this passes. There is then 2 different reports, 2 different years where the department will be providing recommendations and rolling out a whole new program statewide that would allow for the legislature to come back and amend this section, create a new section, maybe create a whole new chapter depending on what is recommended by the department and sort of the experience of rolling out and implementing a whole new program. But I could certainly draft it as a separate section. I think there would be a lot of repetition with this section.
Back to you.
So in subsection B on line 14, this again is sort of clarifying for the complex commercial other unique property appraisals, just making it clear that it's really for the appraisal and litigation assistance, which is elective. And then some sort of conforming changes to make it clear which subdivision applies where. And then subsection C, starting on page 3. Although this whole section would become effective on passage, the actual reappraisal and the schedule for statistical and full reappraisals would not start until July 1st of 2025. So the statute would have this language, which does typically we try to keep dates out of statute, but it's certainly not unheard of to have starting on this date, this program will begin. So the requirements, and again, this is for both municipal and statewide education grant lists. The commissioner would determine a reappraisal schedule, and within the report and progress, the implementation plan and progress report, there's a lot more detail about asking for how would those schedules be set, what are the criteria, how would you prioritize which municipality is getting a reappraisal and on what schedule. Then there are the statistical reappraisals every 2 years. It would not be obviously in the same year that a full reappraisal begins. I did try to ping the 2 years to after the commencement. That could also be after the completion, but that might throw off the whole, so depending on how long a reappraisal takes. So you might want to get more feedback from reappraisers and folks who actually have boots on the ground and how this works, how long it takes. But in terms of having it be on a cycle where it's every 2 years for statistical and then every 6 years for full reappraisals, again, that's after the start of the most recent reappraisal.
Yeah.
Abby, when you say statistical reappraisal, are you referring to the equalization study? Is that different from the equalization study, or are we?
In the different testimony you'd heard, there's a lot of focus on full reappraisal. So for the entire municipality, the statistical, my understanding is that it is different from the equalization study. But I think the department would be able to parse those out, or if you had an appraiser. So the full is really the comprehensive town-wide, whereas the statistical is more limited.
Limited to?
We can have Rebecca in.
Okay.
Rebecca?
Yeah.
What are your feelings on answering
I'll get that
that? Do you want
to Jill.
to, you're welcome to come
Sure.
sit with Abby.
Yeah.
And Jill,
Sure.
you're a very tiny box, so mostly just hearing your voice, if that's okay with you.
That's probably for the best. Jill Remick, Director of Property Evaluation and Review. So the equalization study is our annual process that we do at the state level, analyzing sales across the state, doing the 3-year analysis of property transfer tax returns. So basically property that has changed hands within that 3-year window, comparing that to the grand list and establishing the CLA and the COD and establishing the equalized grand list. So that's very much a statewide process. The towns do their sales verification is the process at the town level, and then our district advisors and analysis do an analysis at the state level, and that's where we come up with our statewide equalization study, which is pretty foundational to Act 60 and Act 68. The statistical reappraisal is something done only in the bounds of that municipality, specific to maybe it's a particular neighborhood or category of property that they do. They can run an analysis for that particular subset of their grand list and update their grand list values accordingly. So they're two very different processes.
Okay, thank you, Jill. I just wanted to be sure I was understanding both of those.
Yep. Great.
Back to you, Abby.
So those are the 3 deliverables in the statute now that would be in effect immediately on passage. So the statistical and the full reappraisals and creating a schedule. Subsection D on line 11 clarifies, because previously it only spoke to the complex and unique properties that were being appraised or under municipality receiving assistance for appraisal and litigation. This just clarifies that this subsection only applies to that litigation and appraisal assistance, not to the reappraisal. The subsection E is new language that was recommended by the department, again, because these sort of 2 programs are being smushed together into this section. It makes it clear here that when a reappraisal is conducted at the state level, those property values and on the grand list are binding on a municipality. So that is new language as well. Okay, so that is the extent of the creation of a new statewide reappraisal program. Next, it gets into current statute on reappraisals, which is where the equalization study comes in, because the director of PBR is looking at how each municipality's grand list relates to fair market value over a 3-year period. So there are a couple of important changes that are being made in current statute to section 4041A. So the first is repealing the per parcel grand list fee, per grand list parcel fee, which is $8.50. Couple of notes on this. It is not currently paid from the ed fund. That is actually sort of a technical change that would need to be made if this fee were kept. It's currently paid out of the general fund, but this draft does strike that. It has been required, so towns have been receiving this $8.50 fee per parcel from the state for reappraisal and grand list maintenance costs. So this draft strikes that fee. And further in the draft, you'll see there is another fee that's expanded, which is for help with equalization study in the grand list. That's expanded from $1 to $2. So there will still be a very small fee going to the towns.
So I'm thinking about when this bill goes, it's, on passage, it will be, but the state won't take on appraisals until 2025. So do we want that fee to go through 2025?
That is a great question. That's something that is addressed in this draft a little bit later. I don't know if you want me to jump ahead, because there are several sections that interact together.
Okay.
But
I can wait.
there is a solution to that problem later on.
Oh, okay.
For us.
Cool.
Appreciate your patience, team.
So this section has a lot going on, a lot of different issues going on in the different subdivisions. So first there's the fee, the next 2 sections, bless you, subsections B and C get at when everyone's talking about what is an ordered reappraisal or required reappraisal. Based on the equalization study, the director of PBR has these 2 different metrics to determine if a grand list is meeting fair market value or not. So the first is the common level of appraisal below 85% or above 115%, or a coefficient of dispersion greater than 20. So it's the CLA and the COD. If those limits or thresholds are met or passed, the director of PBR orders a reappraisal. There's a process where the town can contest and try and come up with a plan. If the municipality fails to meet that plan, there is a current penalty under statute to withhold state funds.
Representative Anthony.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a pitch for tightening up the coefficient of dispersion. That came up 3.5 years ago. We didn't do it because of the overload on the reappraisal vendors.
Like greater than 15 or something? Is that what you mean by tightening? What do you mean? What do you mean by tightening?
I mean, allowing less dispersion, moving it to, say, 15 or 10. That's what I mean. We did raise the CLA. That would trigger an order. And that's a fairness issue. I mean, that's what the coefficient is telling you. You're not treating the same people the same.
I'm trying to keep track of what the municipality is required to do and what's going to be taken over or what would be done by the state. So in this paragraph, if the criteria meet that the director says there's got to be a reappraisal, the municipality is doing the reappraisal, not the state. So the plan that they put together and things like that is done by the municipality.
So there's a confusing, and actually maybe Rebecca would explain this best, but there's a confusing thing we're trying to do here, which is essentially like put a new program in place, but not let everything fall apart either while the new program's being put in place, or if somehow we perhaps fail in 5 years, there would still be a program in place. And so there's sort of like a parallel process of maintaining the existing program while implementing the new program. And so the municipality is responsible essentially until the state is fully prepared to be responsible.
And is that like a different enacting date later on in this?
Exactly.
Okay, thank you.
You're only seeing this, the next section in the bill changes the same language and it takes effect in 25.
I suspect.
Would you add any more words to what I just?
Yeah, well, I think I'll just hop in there to say that I think that this, we've had a short amount of time to review like the actual language presented here this morning. And I think you're doing a very valiant job of threading the needle between like establishing like a clear transition period and then like a future state. But, I still see some places like I think in that section 3 where this language would like suggest that the state would take over, would like perform a reappraisal. And that's kind of, that's like really where we at Tax would like to like tread carefully and hopefully like work more together on that language because of exactly what you said, Representative Kornheiser, like a future legislature maybe hating our implementation plan or, not wanting to fund the office, and then us being in a situation where, we're still compelled by law to be contracting these reappraisals or not having the staffing or, the hearing officers or all that piece to do it. So I think that's a really important dynamic to flag here.
Can just scroll right down to the next. Before I move on to that, I just want to point out that there is this, again, one of the many things going on in this section. There is an appropriation annually to PBR for assessor education. It's being struck from this section, but it's being added in statute to another section where it makes a little more sense because it's very specific to assessor education, but that's sort of more of a technical change. So I'm going to scroll through that quickly. I did have this repeal in subsection E, but I think that should probably be retained, so I can fix that. That's something I didn't catch last night when I was changing this draft. So the PBR would still have the requirement to adopt rules to administer this section. So now moving on to section 3, this is where the effective dates are important because the section we just looked at in section 2 would take effect on passage. Section 3 would take effect July 1st, 2025. So ostensibly when the new program administered by the state would be up and running. And this is where there could be more work done in this section of how you want the trigger for the COD of greater than 20 or another amount, how you want that to interact with the state reappraisal process. So the way this is drafted right now, the director is still required to order a reappraisal. There's still the COD of greater than whatever amount triggers a reappraisal. This particular option, the way this is drafted, it removes the authority for the state to withhold funding and instead just has the director immediately commencing the reappraisal. That's still, an open question for you to decide.
Yeah.
So, two questions. So the CLA no longer becomes a trigger. It's just simply something that adjusts the tax rate based on, okay.
Correct,
It's the COD now is the trigger.
correct.
And, it looks like at the end of the section, before section 4, it is sort of turning over, it's getting turned over to the state.
Right.
Section, you've got the director responsible at the end.
So the towns would no longer be subject to state funding being withheld
Right.
as well. It sort
Right. Yeah,
of
no.
takes away that.
See, that struck too. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's the piece that I was flagging as like, it would be our preference that, and I know this is no easy feat drafting wise, but for the bill to stop short of having the state actually take over reappraisal activity until, a future, session affords us the, office to do that work. But what's, kind of, I don't know, I think elegant here is that the bill does make the 6-year reappraisal cycle effective. So if nothing happened in a future legislature, that piece would at least be in effect for whoever is responsible for doing the reappraisals, which I think is something that all stakeholders have agreed would be a very important adjustment to the reappraisal landscape, is having a set cycle.
Okay. The next section, section 4, relates back to the fee. So the next couple of sections are about funding for towns. So this section does increase the other existing per grand list parcel fee, which is primarily used for equalization study purposes. And it expands the use of the fee so that it can be used for general maintenance of the grand list by towns. The final sentence starting on line 16 was added a couple of sessions ago, which does require towns to keep these fee revenues segregated into a special fund.
Did the $2 come for maintenance out of some dialogue with the Clerks Association, or did you just pluck it, as it were?
To my knowledge, I defer to the chair for the reasoning behind $2.
I'm gonna pick a word that's better than.
Okay, no, that's all right. That's all right. I just wanted to flag it as one of those moving parts.
So in terms of funding, that $8.50 is going away, the $1 is increased to $2, and then section 5 for the transition does have placeholder language for this particular draft, but there is an appropriation authorized in this fiscal, so this upcoming fiscal year 2024. It's an appropriation from the general funds. That's what the per parcel fees are already appropriated from currently. Right now, I think it's about $3 million. So this would appropriate X dollar amount. I put it as million, could be a different amount. Shall be appropriated to the Department of Taxes. It's very broad. It does not have an end date for use of the funds either. So it's for assisting municipalities who are still required under the reappraisal trigger for this with the COD. For grand lists that are lodged on and after April 1st, 2022. So it does go back to grand lists that triggered a reappraisal requirement last year. And then it does have this final clause here saying it's during the transition period after passage of this act and before state reappraisals commence, which is very broad. We do not know exactly when state appraisals would actually commence. So that language could be tightened up. You could also put actual dates there, such as July 1st, 2025, which is what the draft overall and all the effective dates relate back to, assuming that that's the point when state reappraisals would begin. Okay. So that's the extent of the new authority, the changes to the reappraisals when they're triggered. The next section is quite lengthy and has many deliverables being asked of the department to report back to the legislature, the House Committee on Ways and Means, and the Senate Committee on Finance. If you did want to add another committee, you can certainly do that. It didn't seem like this would go to a different committee in terms of jurisdictions, but it could also be appropriations. It could be education if you wish as well, or
Government ops.
operations, yes, sorry. please let me know if you'd like me to add any of those. So the first report is due this coming December 15th, 2023. It's a progress report only. It's on the first 6 months of implementing the Office of Statewide Reappraisals and on any work that's been done to propose definitions. So this is where that other bill you were looking at to define new categories of both homestead and non-homestead property for both grand list, municipal and statewide, and for property tax purposes. So it's a really broad approach, but those were some concerns that were flagged by the department, that the approach in the non-homestead definition bill was limited to non-homestead, but a larger perspective could be taken on defining all of those different property types that you discussed about a month ago.
So the draft bill that we're looking before is now subsection 2.
Yes, there is much more.
There's so many more words.
So many more words.
So many more words.
Okay, but we're no longer doing 2 bills.
No, the two bills have been smushed into one bill.
Lots of smushing. So the second report or deliverable is much more in depth, but that gives the department a 1.5 years to work this out. So first, there is a very detailed implementation plan and progress report, and that's on implementing the statewide system to conduct reappraisals. And that is where the bulk of this section 6 falls. So these are all of, I'm sorry. No, the way I drafted this is a little different. Okay. So this is for December of 2024. There's that implementation plan and report on the statewide office. And then there's actual recommended legislative language defining these new categories and also addressing how that would fit into the grand list, how that would actually be implemented and what the certification process would be, et cetera. Subdivision 2 of section 2 does require the department to look at ways of achieving more consistency in both valuation and taxation in order to prioritize eliminating racial and other implicit bias. So that gets to Davis's presentation, and that could be.
Oh, bless you.
There's a lot of sneezing happening over there today.
Sorry, it's a vintage dress.
Oh.
It's what? Never mind.
It's a vintage dress. That
Oh, okay.
has some mold.
Allergens.
Uh-oh.
No mask needed for you. Back to you, Abby, sorry.
So they're also in the findings that will be referenced in the first section as well. Some of the findings that will be pulled in. So this is where the bulk starts of what is actually required in the report. The first in subdivision 3 is about the statewide Office of Reappraisal. So this gets at all of the different sort of swirling questions and concerns that the committee's been grappling with. So the first in this list, and they are somewhat in order of concern, but I can move them around if you'd like to have one or another of these be the very first order. The first is adequate funding, so including cost-saving measures and the reallocation of the revenues from the $850 per parcel fee that is being repealed, which was about $3 million. To operate this new office, it requires a report on the staffing costs, both for hiring trained assessors. I'm realizing it could say hiring and contracting. If you want, I can add that in because the commissioner does have that authority. To carry out reappraisals as well as hiring hearing officers. And there is an emphasis here at holding appeals throughout the state, so at locations across the state. And there is another subdivision specifically dedicated to appeals.
Are those hearing officers always the same and they go travel? I can't remember.
So I think there are currently only a handful, although I will look to the department on how that's structured. And my understanding is they do travel, but this is a recommendation in a report, so it could be.
I think the idea is that there would be, PVR would be creating a plan for how many hearing officers and how professionalized those hearing officers should be and where they should be and how local to communities they should be, or, you know, that whole thing, because that's a big part of solving this problem. It's that, you know, I think that's part of where we got lost when last time we had this conversation. It was how do we bridge the divide between the community and the Department of Taxes? And the hearing officer is really that bridge. And we know that the very part-time folks are not gonna do it.
I would think that they, not to say, but they could reach out to how things are going with Act 250 and see if they could learn from all the good things that are happening there and all the things where things are not quite working as they might. Can you put that in there?
Do you want to add language that,
Let's think about that, as we go. I think sometimes putting Act 250, the word Act 250 into a bill is creates things sometimes for people. But I also hear that like there's a lot to be learned from what works and doesn't work in that
Maybe it
system.
could be a letter sent after that.
Rebecca, will the tax department take into account how Act 250 hearing officers work and don't work when you're working on this?
I will eagerly learn about how active hearing officers work. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, it seems like a great reference point.
also, there's another subdivision in this that talks specifically about appeals, so you could have a further subdivision within that saying to consider how other appeals, there are lots of different aspects of state government where there are administrative hearings held. So looking at other examples, like I know almost every department has their own staff and attorneys and hearing officers of different levels that can certainly inform the way the department proposes to create an appeal structure. So something like that could be included.
And I can assure you that we would be looking at what other agencies are doing, if nothing more than to think about what spaces are available throughout the state for doing this work locally. You know, if our partner departments or agencies have local branches. We at the tax department are just 133 right now, 133 State Street, to be clear.
Peter and then Jim.
It's at the moment too small a cadre of hearing officers, one of whom, Camilla Roberts, we heard from extensively on one of those. I know that the cadre will have to be expanded. Contra Act 250, I really feel strongly about the availability of those folks who now travel to go to a space in the town in which the appeal is triggered. And there's always space, almost always space for that. It's not a large number of people. And rather than the appellant having to go to some central location, I just think that would be a gift to the locals, so to say, in the reorganization.
Yeah, I may be restating the obvious when I read going through this, but there are two very big things that happen in this bill. One is there's a whole bunch of stuff that has to happen before statewide reassessments begin on a rolling program. That in itself is a pretty big thing. But by necessity, there's a whole lot of stuff in this bill. I'm just using the generic term stuff.
Appreciate it.
That wisely needs to be set forth so that we all understand it, so that we can go forward to that. So I started going through this with you on the screen, saying, "Oh, this is kind of easy. This is kind of easy." But in fact, this is a pretty big lift. So I would say very sensible, very necessary to get from here to there. So I mean, we've shared each of our thoughts around the table, I guess, or something. But I again would divide this bill into two parts, about a lot of very necessary stuff that we may tinker with a little bit, and then the I don't know what you want to call it. Maybe we get to the new thing, which is a rolling statewide reassessment program, which I think is very welcome because we certainly have a banged up program and nothing else. Whatchamacallits that are way out of whack, town by town by town. So So, okay, good start.
Ditto.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Stuff included, right?
I like Stuff and Smush as my two favorite legal terms.
Well,
I mean, I like that, before we're talking about like a hard stop, it very quickly jumped in something
Yeah.
else, and I appreciate, holding, like, gotta keep moving, but we gotta get in a different direction.
I don't see any point in being more articulate than anybody else.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I'm the one who uses Smush all the time.
Okay, I'll let,
Smushy stuff.
so, anyway.
The next subdivision, so the deliverable for this detailed implementation plan is the administration of the reappraisals, both full and statistical, for municipal and state education grant lists in each municipality. This includes, and speaking of articulate, this subdivision might need a little more tightening up. It's gotten very wordy. So it includes selection and prioritization criteria and any other recommendations for establishing a reappraisal schedule. So my imagining how this would flow in a year and a half, 2 years, is that this section in particular would likely include some legislative proposals to change 5413 if that's the section that's being that's authorizing and requiring the commissioner to conduct reappraisals. That this would really get at. Here are maybe some things that should be in statute or should be given to the department as a rulemaking authority. This is how the reappraisal schedule will work. A couple of long sentences here are getting at the concern over municipalities that have been ordered to reappraise and have been ordered to reappraise the longest, so are sort of outstanding, provided there are a few provisos here to say that no municipality should be required to reappraise in fewer than 5 years. So if a municipality just reappraised this year or next year, and then there's this new program taking effect in 2025, they won't then immediately have to reappraise again. So it's trying to sort of hold those municipalities, unless they hold harmless, but not put the pressure on those municipalities that have gone through the whole trigger order reappraisal process and completed their reappraisals most recently. That said, I acknowledge this section is getting a little verbose. Maybe needs a little more work. But just trying to get at more data and more reporting on what is the state or the status of reappraisals throughout the state. The next subdivision gets